What if seeking isn't about finding answers, but growing into the silence they leave behind? At some point, the questions fall away, and what's left is the light we've been trying to name. This is Seekers and Finders. I just want to welcome everybody to our new fall lineup. We've taken the summer off. We had some reruns, but we're back, and we're looking forward. We're looking forward to a great season.
Yeah, big. We have a big fall lineup. I'm telling you, if you watch the podcast in the past, and if you like them, I'm telling you, you're in for a treat because we got some really great guests, and we're kicking off our fall season with Lorcan Otway. He's a sort of a neighbor of mine. I live in Roxbury, New York, and Lorcan, you are in Grand Gorge.
Grand Gorge. We actually drove through Roxbury Run the other day, so we know exactly where you are. We were
Hey, you should have knocked on the door. Anyway, it's good to have you because you were a guest on my radio show, Seekers and Finders, over WIOX Community Radio Catskills 91.3 FM twice already. So I think we're going to cover a lot of the same ground, but anything that you want to throw in that's new, we're always open to hearing new stuff.
my preliminary news is, as we've been commencing the project on the museum, I always like to find a way to make the work of our museum speak to the moment. So even though we are dealing with the early history of Grand Gorge and this part of the Catskills, we are commencing a project called the Daniel Webster Project. And the idea is that in building the museum, we are going to be outward inviting people of the most diverse political opinions and groups to recapture that idea of America, that we all work together no matter how opposed we are to each other's ideals and backgrounds, and that what makes America great is working together, and working together regardless of political opinion, ethnicity, orientation. Any of the things that divide us are not as important as pulling together to build this museum, which is a model of the community that was built here.
Talk a little about the museum itself, because I know we spoke extensively on the radio program, but people tuning into this for the first time, the museum is in Grand Gorge, right here in upstate New York, beautiful upstate New York. And tell me what's the background on that? How did you come about
the sensible place to begin? We are on Lenape hunting land, and for me, the great comforting irony is that the Lenape who hunted here lived in Alphabet City in Manhattan, and would come up to this part of the Catskills to hunt in the winter. It's a pattern that I'm very familiar with. I worked in American Indian law and worked with the Mistashipu Innu, who are the northernmost Algonquin people in Canada. And their base camp village during the summer was in a place called Maliotnam, and they would hunt up into Labrador, up to the northernmost reaches of Labrador during the winter. That in the winter, all the streams become highways for their sleds, and so we're basically building a ethnographic picture of the peopling of this part of the Catskills. John Moore was a Highland Scot, and he was the first European to settle here just before the Revolutionary War. And Joseph Brant, the brilliant statesman and British officer among the Mohawk, warned him that the Northeastern Native Alliance was going to be clearing settlers from this area because Brant was very interested in keeping civilians out of the fighting. So uh, he moved down to Hudson where he became a Minuteman. And later created after the war, created a tavern at the juncture of 30 and 23, which is about 1,000 feet from where we are building the museum. Then the next families that came, the Scudders and the Corbins were Quakers like myself. And at that time, it was the last years or the beginning of the end of slavery in this part of the Catskills. So we're presenting their cabin. We're building cabins, I should say, for each of the ethnic groups. And the Quaker cabin will be a stop on the Underground Railroad, then a free black family and a Huguenot family. And then we're working with the Lenape in Canada, who were the band that were down here, to create a Lenape wigwam and cabin. And then the unseen colonials in the 1620s, Romani people were deported from Scandinavia and Britain to the Northeast here. And so a lot of the copper work, a lot of the early goldsmithing was done by Romani people. So we're building a nomadic Lovari camp, Romani Chal camp, actually, in the 2.67 acres of the museum. So, oh,
Gary, your mic is off.
I turned my mic off because Ann came home with the dogs. I don't want to bark. So Lorcan, we'll post a link to people contacting you if they want to come out and visit the museum. I know it's not finished,
absolutely.
but it's in progress. I know you give people tours. So for people in this area, the Catskills, who want to visit this museum. Now, one thing you mentioned Quakers, and we want to explore that a bit because a lot of what we do on the podcast is talk to people about their spiritual journeys, but along with anything else that pops up that's relevant. So let's talk, and I know you have two sides. You have your Quaker side, you have your Romani side. Let's talk about your Quaker side a little bit and kind of fill in where does the Quakerism come into your life and what you're doing and with the museum.
My father's family were Anglo-Irish and Salvationists. They were a titled Irish family, so the Salvationists were heavily hierarchical. So they actually began the Salvation Army with Booth, and my father was greatly offended by the hierarchical aspect, and so as a very young man, he was drawn to Quakerism. And he was also bisexual, so I think that the aspect of Quakerism not being rule bound spoke to his heart. And he, in 1947, fell in with my mother and married the Romani side of the family, and in many ways was kind of at war with Romani culture, did not sit well with his Quakerism. And yet, for me, I used to say that instead of being half Quaker and half Romani, I was doubled, that I am completely Romani in that context, and I am completely Anglo-Irish Quaker on that side. And I think when I've been asked to describe Quakerism, I've always said that it's a process by which one attempts to empty the self of ego and invite God to fill that space. And we place a great deal of emphasis on listening, listening to that still silent voice within, that voice that tells a bird when to fly south in the winter. We basically know right from wrong. And if we push out our own wants and desires and try and listen to that voice of God, most of us find what I think is a cooperative answer. And I think that's the nutshell version of Quakerism. And we worship silently.
And you have
So
You have a meeting at your place in Grand Gorge. Again, those who
We do. We have a worship group. The closest formal meeting is either Quaker Street near Delancey, about 45 minutes up 30 towards Albany, or down 23 to Hudson. There's a wonderful little meeting house. Both are very old meetings and old meeting houses. There are three of us who more or less meet regularly on Sunday. And worship groups are basically Quaker meetings that have not yet become big enough to be formalized with but I grew up in a very, very large meeting in New York. I was the historian for the 15th Street meeting, and I was on Ministry and Council, which is the for the Quaker Quarter in New York, the body that organizes the Quaker meetings for New York City and Flushing and Staten Island. But basically, our role, I've always seen my role in Ministry and Council there as keeping the conversation going. We make our decisions by coming to unity rather than compromise. In other words, we try and find that moment of agreement where we all agree that this is the right thing to do. And I refer to that as inviting God into the process, that we try and push out our institutional uh, uh, ego as well as our personal ego. And that if we listen to each other, we find that answer. It took us, for example, 100 years to disavow slavery, though most Quakers were against slavery. But to find that complete unity took us 100 years. And so we were the first religious body to do that. And I think we did it right. So, yes.
So, Lorcan, I'm curious to know how your mother's Romani side influenced you, if it had just as much power in your life, because basically it's a totally different kind of ceremony. I mean, it's more magical and more mystical, we'll say, in their ceremonial ways, as opposed to the Quaker, which is, very pragmatic and
Very up here.
yeah, exactly. So, what kind of influence did your mother have on you? Because it seems to me that you have more Quaker influence embodied in your whole life.
This is because we're talking about Quakerism. There have been periods where I've shaved my beard for over a year with my mustache and felt very uh, home, although I haven't been able to really wear gold in a lot of that aspect. But the putting on my Romani hat, rather than speaking philosophically, I'll tell you a story. My in my mother's culture, you don't say things that should not happen, and if you do so by mistake, you say "Mek Jalariatsa," go into the night. You take the curse off what you've said. So one day, a native community that I worked with gave me an honor gift of a beaded fringed jacket, which my mother, who was a chief designer for Calvin Klein, hated. So as I was going out of the house, she said, "If you go out of the house wearing that jacket, you're going to get stuck in a revolving door and killed." And I said, "Mom, say Megjal. What do you mean? Putting," and she goes, "No." I said, "You're putting a curse on your son?" She goes, "No, I'm putting a curse on that jacket." So my Quaker hat, I could not throw that jacket out. My Romani hat, I have it now 15 years later, and I have not worn it once. So the two lives come together, not always comfortably, but definitely another moment where with the Romani world, I have to tell a story. I can't be cerebral. I was at a Romani Chal Roma wedding in, I think, Maryland or Delaware, and there must have been 1,000 people there. I had just been involved with a case, a Madeline Toogood case that went international here. And I was there because they were afraid that there was going to be press at the wedding, and they wanted someone to handle the press. And so as I'm passing the children's table, which was huge, and it was toddlers to teenagers, one of the teenagers invites me over and he says, Mr. Otway, do you mind if I ask you a question? And I said, as long as you call me Lorcan, be my guest. None of the Mr. Otway bit. And he says, there's a rumor that your mother's a Turk. Turk is the derogatory term that Romani Chols use for, or actually Irish travelers use for Eastern European, what we would call true gypsies. And so I respond, yes, in that context, my mother is a Turk, but not a rag-headed Turk, which means that she does not live traditionally, but she is, and in reality, when she's not at work, she wore her décolleté and her earrings, but she lived in the mainstream world as well. And he said, is it true that we come out of your people's tribe? And I said, I could give you the answer that I would give in law school to a law school class, or I can tell you a story. And they said, oh yeah, tell us a story. So I said, all the people spoke to God. And God said to the Kalacho, to the black people, here's Africa, a quarter of the world, because I love you so much. It's all yours. And then he turns to the Asian people and he says, here's Asia, a quarter of the world. It's yours because I love you so much. Then he turns to the Europeans and he says, here's Europe, a quarter of the world, because I love you so much. And to the Native Americans, here's Turtle Island, 2 continents making up a quarter of the world, and it's yours because I love you so much. And then he turns to the Lovari, and to the Kalderash, and to the Romani Chols, and the Tatare, and all the nomadic people of the earth. And he says, and you, my children, you're my favorite children. And a young Kalderash kid jumps on, he takes off his hat, he throws it on the ground, so now the hat is ruined. You can never put it on your head again. This is, God, are you crazy? You give a quarter here, you give a quarter. What did you remember for your children, your favorite children? And he says, the whole planet. That we who have nothing have everything. And so in that, yes, we all came out of India together. And for those who didn't, our culture did. The Pavis, the Irish travelers, are not, for the most part, ethnically Rom. But if Ireland is a Celtic nation, because the Celtic migrations stop in Wales, and we, in our earliest population, are Proto-Portuguese. But because we speak a Celtic language, because we are infused with Celtic culture, we are a Celtic nation. I delivered a paper at Trinity Law School back in 2004. That one of the implications of the paper was that Irish travelers are not ethnically Rom, but they are a Romani people. We are one people, Yekmanushan. And so if that kind of gives some sense of the Romani world.
So on that note, it seems that, even the Quakers feel there's a separation between the humans and God, to the extent that God speaks to them and tells them not about that they are part of the whole creation, but that they are separate and he rules over them in a sense.
That's a wonderful question.
Let me just finish. Let me just finish the thought here. So when Jesus proclaimed the kingdom of heaven is within, most people, I don't think, understood that as being that we are all the part of the divine. That if we're searching for the kingdom of heaven, we're not having to look to the sky, but to look within, because we're all divine. We're all actually that divine being. So how does this reconcile with the thoughts of the Romani, which do have all these ceremonial ideas about this higher entity, as well as the Quakers who sit in a kind of performance ceremony where they've created these rules for themselves that are not constricting. So how does that work?
These are two wonderful questions. So the second question on Romania, the way of gypsies, as we would use the term, as opposed to, let me begin with the Quaker idea of our relationship with God. We actually began, George Fox, who was the founder of our faith, went north in England and fell in with a group called the Seekers, and very much began Quakerism as a process rather than an outcome, and a process of listening and a process of discernment. And that created two distinct traditions which fell out with each other in 1828, 1829, when a young girl named Hannah Bernard stood up in meeting in Jericho, New York, and said, as a woman, I cannot see the need for or accept the reality of Mary's virginity. It just does not strike me that this is a necessary part of my understanding of Christ. And as is typical in a New York meeting, everyone kind of nodded and thought about it. And she then went to Ireland and Britain. Again, this is 1825 maybe, and she said the same thing. And the British Quakers were outraged because, as you might know from sociology, the British culture likes to pigeonhole things very tightly. And so they wrote back to the meeting in New York to a fellow named Elias Hicks, who was the clerk of the Jericho meeting. And they demanded that he have her read out of meeting, which means that she's still Quaker, could still marry, still go to meeting, but she doesn't have a voice in the business of the meeting. And he wrote back and said, I never really thought about it much. I fully understand why she feels the way she does as a woman on the nature of God and virginity and Christ. And I can't say that I really have an opinion one way or the other. I haven't really thought about it, but no, I can't read her out of meeting for that. So they then wrote to the Philadelphia yearly meeting, which was a very politically important meeting, and demanded that Elias Hicks be read out of meeting. And that split Quakerism into the Hicksite tradition and what called itself the Orthodox Quakerism, which concentrated on the Christian aspect of Quakerism and to some degree removed that idea of process in Quakerism. Well, the Orthodoxy then had to address the problem of contradictions, that seeming contradictions in the Bible. And so the Wilburites said, if you find a contradiction in the Bible, go with that voice within, seek. And the Gurneyites said, no, there are no contradictions in the Bible. And so the Orthodoxy split and began to split for the next 100 years into a subway map of different little factions. In the 1950s, we began to realize that we were all working on the same issues socially, our work in the Underground Railroad during the Civil War, our anti-war work during the Second World War in Korea and later Vietnam. And so we began to heal the two factions so that we could do things. For example, my meeting in the mid-60s when I was a youngster joined with a Wilburite meeting so that we could expand Friends School. And we set aside the discussion of theology. It wasn't important. With the rise what is probably what would be called the third awakening of American fundamentalism. Quakerism is beginning to split a bit, and more Quakers are defining themselves either as New Age Quakers, Hicksite Quakers, or Wilbrites or Gurneyites or Beanites, or all the various little factions. So, but I think that the kind of the last word on that is two Quakers were asked about whether they were Quakerisms or Trinitarians, and they were sitting out in front of a meeting house, and they looked at each other, and one said, I don't know if he is. I haven't really thought about it much. And the other Quaker said, yeah, I don't. Again, I wouldn't speak for the other members of our meeting. I don't think I'm a Trinitarian. I haven't really thought about it much. And that's kind of the example of Quakerism as a process and a process of discernment. On the Romani side, about 30 years ago, we were targeted, and I hope I'm not using this as a pejorative term, but we were targeted by the evangelical movement. And it was the first time in our history that the Romani community was divided on spiritual issues. And when I say the Romani community, the Vlasica, my mother's, which are the kind of the classic traditional Eastern European home. And we had been fighting politically as a Romani activist for inclusion in societies without assimilation, that to be defined by our spiritual beliefs of Romania. And the evangelical movement promised inclusion, or I should say, promised assimilation without inclusion, rather than inclusion without assimilation. And so they set out to attack our traditions. For example, the Pumana, when a Romani person dies, there's a series of periods at first where you don't speak their name, where you allow them to go forward on their journey, and then you have a feast to lay their soul to rest, a Pumana, and they would choose usually a member of the community who's in the most need, and they would give this person gifts that they would have given to the person in life in a huge feast. And after the banquet, which the tables are piled 3 and 4 feet high with food, everybody takes boxes of food home, and there's still huge amounts of food on the table. But the family of the deceased doesn't take any. They take the remaining food and distribute it charitably to orphanages, to homeless shelters, and the Pumana is becoming more and more. The last Pumana I went to, the born again community stood against the wall in protest, and a small group of us lived our traditions of laying our sister to rest.
Well, now I may get flack about this,
yeah.
But it seems that the orthodoxy in all religions are the most biased and the most discriminating when it comes to broader thinking on how the religion should unfold. And, the orthodoxy uses the Bibles of all the different religions to state the absolute truth, yet they're stuck. They've kind of shackled the whole religion and not allowed it to experience or explore a greater vision of what perhaps the divine or consciousness that's playing this whole thing has in mind. So did your mother experienced this discrimination from the more hierarchical elites in the Romani sect?
No, her greatest fear was discrimination from the Gajikane, the non-gypsy world. She she was a chief designer, shoe designer at Calvin Klein throughout her whole career. The two things she feared the most. In the early 1930s, she went to Cooper Union. Actually, the mid 1930s, she went to Cooper Union, where she organized for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And she was a lifelong progressive, between progressive and red. At times, certainly after the so many in the American left were were destroyed by Stalinism, and then afterwards felt a sense of loss by the fact that the cohesive movement of American left became less and less authentic in many ways. And so Mom became very active in progressive causes, but was not really a joiner. Uh, but the one of my favorite things about my mother had a very subtle sense of humor, and one day, and I think it was either at Calvin Klein or just before Calvin Klein, someone made a dumb blonde joke at the board table, and my mother was anything but blonde, and she looked thoughtful for a minute. She said, in my whole life, I have no idea where this idea of the dumb blonde comes from. I think I've only known one person who might have been a dumb blonde. She said, after the fall of Madrid, we held a party at Cooper Union to welcome the Abraham Lincoln Brigade members from the school back home. And so, of course, we invited the artist models. And one of the girls, who I think was a blonde, asked one of the links which side they fought on. And I think that was the only dumb blonde I've ever met. And it was Mom's way of subtly establishing how she felt about the culture, the boardroom culture of telling dumb blonde jokes and all. And for Mom, that was I thought it was one of the few times that she would make a reference to her background. We had a common friend. I worked as a fashion journalist for a while, and one of my editors was a wonderful journalist named Vivian Infantino. And in the early 60s, my mother lowered the heels of shoes, broadened the front of the shoe while still having shape, but my mother understood the anatomy of the foot completely. She had said that she didn't believe that women's shoes should cripple them. And Vivian gave a subtle kind of joke which disturbed Mom greatly, in that the headline in Footwear News was Florence Otway's Great Leap Forward. And it was just exactly Vivian kind of a wink and a nod to my mother's politics, that she was so afraid of people finding out. So
Wow, that's
I think we got off the subject, but yes, I think you're right that the problem with orthodoxy and the problem with progressivism is that there are two major personality types on Earth. Um, there are those who are inventive and interpretive and are always trying to push the culture forward. And then there are those who take that drive forward and want to define it so tightly that it's constrained. And what Quakerism sought to do, I think one of the great strengths of Quakerism, which is now under attack, is that this idea of having to find perfect agreement. You have these two completely opposite personalities having to find that common ground of forward motion and control of anarchy. And I should say, not the positive anarchy of us all listening to each other and pulling together, but that anarchy of the strongest voices pushing the agenda. And so I think that the problem with orthodoxies is that they keep trying to define themselves more and more tightly, and any two people, any one person will eventually become a heretic to their own most cherished ideals. And the problem with uh, what has come to be called ADHD is that you're always inventing to the point that you never build. And so you need to find that middle ground. And I think that's what Quakerism used to try and do. What happened was we made the mistake of building schools, and our schools became bastions of the elite. And the elite wanted them to compete not only educationally, but socially with others of their class. And so the schools became less and less Quaker. Um, I, on ministry and council, was in a position of raising the question of are our schools still Quaker? And in that process, for the first time, we began to hear a phrase called the sense of the meeting, where the clerk of the meetings would say, well, we've talked about this long enough. Generally speaking, it seems that and it became more and more majoritarian because efficiency became the new catchword, not doing it right. And I went on a 10-year meeting, witness of absence from my home meeting, which was very, very painful because I felt that by doing that, God was being removed from the process, that process of listening to that of God and each other. And I would go to meetings that had no schools and had the least property so that I could have that authentic sense of unity in meeting, because we weren't fighting over what we're seeing not only in Quakerism, but throughout the United States, the elite taking over the more and more of the those things held in common, and the property and the those things that were built by artists and working people. I spent 59 years building my family businesses, and the new organized crime of development stole it from us. And so it's not just Quakerism, this idea that everything can be bought and everything is a commodity is part of, I think, what is wrong in America today. And I think that the solutions aren't political, but they're cultural and spiritual. And we have to go back to that sense of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, that we're all in this together. And we are all reveling in the major differences that we have with each other. As long as, at the end of the day, we work together to make a society that respects each other and listens to each other, works together. And I think that that's where my Quakerism and my Romani culture meet the road with building this museum and building my businesses in the past.
Yeah, the fear of loss, of self-worth, and of course the mighty dollar has played the biggest part in what's going on right now. Actually, my parents sent me to a friend's school in Philadelphia in kindergarten and in first grade, and they must have had a sense that this school was more evolved than the schools that were around my neighborhood. I was bused into Center City to the Friends School. So there was always an understanding. The Quakerism played such an important part in Philadelphia in every possible way. I mean, they gave William Penn, this wonderful statue in the center of town. So there is a consciousness in Philadelphia of this Quakerism that is an undercurrent of the way the city of brotherly love is imagined.
Imagined is the word, exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, what are you're living in Canada now, right?
No, no, no. I'm in upstate New York, actually about 15 minutes from Gary.
Oh, okay. Okay. So, is there a Romani and Quaker community that is kind of near where you are, or you left that whole congregation when you left, uh, you know, wherever you
Yeah.
were brought up?
No, no. The Romani. I'll deal with the Romani question first. I've run into Romani people here, some of whom have recently immigrated, not in the immediate area, but in Kingston and some of the towns around here. And because of my complexion, they're always surprised when I greet them in Romanes, and but I've been still very active politically. A few times I've gone into New York City for conventions and such. Um, but the whole story of Romani politics is another whole story. It's We are not a people. We're mostly people that live in hiding. That there's a wonderful book about Romanis in America called "The Hidden Americans." That we I made T-shirts for. There was a horrible case of Romani people being driven out of Bulgaria. And there was a terrible murder of a Romani person. We were holding a meeting in front of the Bulgarian embassy with American Home, and I made a T-shirt about who we are, and nobody wanted to wear the T-shirt because although they were home and were there expressing outrage over what happened, they were still afraid to come out publicly as being gypsy. A handful did, most didn't. Um, then the Quakerism that helped establish the community died out in that first generation. By the 1820s, there was not a Quaker community in Grand Gorge. The nearest Quaker community, I think, is two Quakers who have a meeting house from the 1700s in Neversink. But the we used to be a very, very big religion in the States. We had two presidents who were Quaker. Uh, Richard Nixon, who epitomized honesty and peace, and Herbert Hoover, who epitomized good business sense. So where it always reminds me that there are no nirvanas, that we are always hopefully working towards and trying for perfection. But the real world is not a place with easy boundaries and sharp lines often.
So, with that said, the boundaries and sharp lines, have you stepped over some of these sharp lines and expanded your feelings about spirituality and
Oh,
divinity in ways beyond your natural culture of Quakerism and Romani? Can you give us some thought on that?
actually, this is a story. We Quakers are I'll introduce this with a short story. I was working on a political asylum case for two Romani brothers, and they spent almost a year in the New Jersey holding cells, which were and are horrendous. And on New Year's Eve, one of the Dragomir brothers called me and he said, I lived through you in this horrible place I am. Tell me what you're doing tonight. I said, oh, you're asking a Quaker. My wife and I are going to our meeting house, which is a plain wooden room with wooden benches that are painted gray. There's no pictures on the wall, no stained glass windows, no altar. And we all sit silent, about 200 of us, for an hour. And then we shake hands and go home to bed. And he said, that's terrible. That's what I'm doing for New Year's Eve. So, but for the most part, I think my spiritual journeys have expanded my sense of Quakerism. Um, I learned very early on working with native communities never to ask for anything, because in a traditional native community, there's virtually no way to say no. And that especially things of a spiritual nature would be offered to me when elders felt it was appropriate. So, for example, I worked for many, many years before I was invited to do a sweat. And when I did, it was a very, very traditional sweat, extraordinarily intense, but it also was illuminating in my sense that religions don't, God doesn't choose between religions, that we all are all seeking together to find that voice within. And I had actually forgotten what the second story I was going to tell you after the introduction to the. Oh, I remember now. My wife is Catholic, and um, being my mother being an artist and growing up in a family of rich imagery, um, I used to be fascinated by friends of mine homes who were Catholic. You'd go in and they'd be somber and filled with statues, and the kitchen would, especially in Italian families, would be the bright room in the house, and but the statues were just. And so after marrying Jeannie, I also became very drawn to St. Anthony, and I found this beautiful uh, statue of St. Anthony. And we Quakers are not kind of into saints, would be the way to put it. So I brought home this statue of St. Anthony, and then being Irish, a little while later, I found by the same artist this wonderful St. Patrick, and I brought back the St. Patrick. Then next, he had done this wonderful St. Nicholas. So for Christmas, I brought this great St. Nicholas. And Jeannie said after a while, she said, wait a minute. These aren't really for me, are they? They're your deprived Quaker upbringing, your dour Quaker upbringing. You're bringing all these saints into the house for yourself, aren't you? You caught me. Yes, indeed. So, and I do find a spiritual connection, which most Quakers, but again, we're not a doctrinaire people, most Quakers would not understand. But that the idea of the example of saints, um, as reminded me by statues, is not at all, it's much more Romani than Quaker. But as the wonderful line from Dairy Girls, I do buzz on a good statue. So,
Well, it seems that there is some kind of wake-up call that happens either through tremendous amount of pain or an expansion of the heart center, because one is feeling not sadness, but a sense of joy at the wonderful things that are possible for us to do. And it goes beyond the statues. I mean, we have to stop looking at the idols, these icons that supposedly give us a sense of being. And I know Gary disagree. We had this little back and forth the other day, but for me, it's the many paths lead to the one. As long as that you can understand beyond the words of the path what's really lying inside of you. And again, I go back to Jesus' words of the kingdom of heaven resides within. So from that starting point of the kingdom of heaven resides within you, can you give us more on these uplifting experiences that you might have had in either the Quaker sense or in the Romani magical, mystical, ideals that are in that.
I think you hit on a number of very important points in this. The idea that the role of the pains of life in coming close to God. I had a friend whose mother was Opus Dei, and she could not understand why she was as poor as she was and had suffered as much as she did. We were speaking about it one day, and I said to her, God doesn't promise us outcome for our faith. God promises us the strength to accept that life is hard and that um, in the act of creation, there is the act of decay and pain. It's a very Vedic ideal that comes from into our experience as Romani people, that there is Shiva and Ganesh, that you can't have forward motion without the pain of destruction, and that that through this the goal is to find through God, through our faith, the strength to accept. The My sense of ministry in Quakerism is that, unlike now when we talk about stories, in worship, the best kind of worship is complete silence. But if you feel that there is something that has come to you that must be shared, you share it in the fewest words without the story involved. And it came to me one day, one of the messages that I could not resist giving in meeting was, discipline thyself to love, it makes all things bearable. Excuse me, discipline thyself to joy, it makes all things bearable. Discipline thyself to faith, it makes all things possible. Discipline thyself to love, it makes all things new. And I think that that's the ideal of through religious art, through anything that, as a Quaker, I would disavow as a fetish, as a, pray to this and this will happen, but that it reminds us that through discipline, we could aim at these virtues of finding that strength in acceptance of God's plan, even when God's plan is horrifically painful and destroys us. And it's the hardest thing. And I've this past few years been going through the loss of everything I built in my life. And a number of people have said when I tell the stories about it, how often I joke about it and laugh. I think that's a purely Irish thing to do, because at the end of the day, when you've been kicked down in the mud and trampled on by a horse, crying about it really doesn't help. Laughing about it gives you the strength to understand that the world is bigger than our hopes and desires. So,
So the Romani background is Indo-Aryan. So I mean, it's very closely tied to India. And you mentioned Shiva as one of the hierarchical gods in the religion. Is that correct? I mean, Shiva.
we like Santeria and many, we had forgotten where we came from. And so many of the concepts became translated in the Vlasica. We would call the concept of Shiva Kali Maria, Black Mary, and the concept of Ganesh would be Saint Sarah. In the Irish traveler community, my band, for example, was Sorcha Dorcha, Sarah of darkness, Sarah meaning of light, and Dorcha meaning of darkness, and that it's this joining of the two that creates the motion in the universe. So we came out of about 900 years ago, out of India we were Rajapati. We came from near Chandigarh, and we're lost the battle as the Muslim community began to come in from the west, or the east, excuse me, the west, and we were driven down into uh, uh, Persia, to Constantinople, where we were for about 200 years and adopted Persian grammar, but still 70% of our language was Hindi, and it is still Hindi. And then with the fall of Constantinople, we drifted into Western Europe and now in 41 nations. And so during that diaspora, we when we first arrived in Western Europe, my grandfather, my mother's father, looked like he left India yesterday. And so, as a dark complected people, um, during the Crusades, we were thought that to be Saracens. We had no idea who we were. We had traveled through Persia and North Africa and learned about Coptic Christians. So we said, "Oh no, we're not Muslims. We're Coptic Christians. We're Egyptians," which is where the gypsy part of Egyptian comes in. And we were given the right to pass through but not settle. And so much of our philosophy is the Vedic concepts, especially of acceptance, matched with this idea that we were always on the verge of destruction. We come into Scotland in the Middle Ages, and shortly thereafter, James of Scotland says that because he's a humanitarian, that he will hang all the Romani men, but only drown the Romani women and children. And yet we are a very persistent community. So you still find a strong community of Romani people, Flashika in Scotland, the Romani Churls. And the wonderful moment in the movie about Rob Roy, where he confronts the Romani people who have stolen sheep. And what the movie doesn't go into is Rob Roy was part Romani as well. He was Romani Chal. So we're a tenacious people, and part of that is the acceptance of the pain of life. And I was working on a criminal case with a very traditional family, and where we had a very innocent defendant, and I'm the last one to sugarcoat if we're defending a guilty person. There's many ways to begin to talk about defense, but the prosecutor had played the gypsy card throughout, and we had a hung jury, even though we had concrete evidence not only that he did not do what he was accused of, but what the true story was. But the after we had the hung jury, the whole family and legal team went to Chinatown near the courts, we were going to have a big meal, and everybody was very sad. And the young defendant sitting at the head of the table, he looks down the table and says, "Look at all these unhappy faces." He says, "Did you forget who we are? I'm not going to jail today. I might go to jail down the road for this. But today we're here to enjoy ourselves because I'm not in jail." And that's the typical Romani ideal of living in the moment and not caring for, knowing that life is going to be painful and hard, but that in the moment to live where you are and enjoy where you are.
Well, Jesus being the essence of love, and Shiva being the essence of transformation. I mean, they call him the god of destruction, but
Yeah.
It's really transformation.
Yeah.
So would you have both statues in your home? And how do you reconcile the love side and the transformation side, which are both extremely powerful essences.
In fact, I have the Pietà on my desk there. Shiva right here. Gene, could you just hand me the Pietà and Shiva? Um, I don't think I found Ganesh yet in the things I was able to save when the federal marshals drove us out of the house. But of course, there's our Pietà and Shiva, Gene, right next to the Romani wagon. So I do, and again, these things cause me to remember where in my journey, in my family, we are. Shiva's there we are. Yeah. So absolutely. And I also should say that when I was on my way to law school, when I went back to college to study history and political science, my self-created major was the study of heresy. And because I figured that a lot of my legal career would be involved in dealing with Class A1 drug felonies, which are the witchcraft trials of our day, the idea of using a made-up idea of crime to deal with a medical problem. And I had always been fascinated by what have come to be referred to as the apocryphal Gospels, but in reality are some of the oldest stories, those that didn't make the cut when the Council of Nicaea basically created modern Christianity. And in so many of the earliest Gospels, you have this idea of looking within of the kingdom of God being here and now. In fact, there is a wonderful movie for people who haven't studied the Nag Hammadi Gospels and such, called Stigmata. And when I first saw it, about the first three-quarters of the film, you think you're watching a horror film and a ghost story, and then more and more it reveals itself as the story of the Nag Hammadi Gospels. And I think that so many, I think it's a mistake where people say, no, there was not a Jesus Christ. It's made up of aspects of Egyptian stories of, I think rather we live the allegory of God and God's plan every generation in many ways. And sometimes that allegory is made perfect, whether by history or by the retelling of stories and retelling of stories. And I think that the story of Yeshua, of Jesus, has so much richness, especially when you look at it also as a Jewish story. The idea of forgiveness, of the sin of trying to force God's hand, and the atonement and looking within in the last 12 words of Jesus forgiving himself and forgiving God for not delivering Judea from the Romans, but rather realizing that he has lived God's plan. And there are so many ways to look at the meaning of that. So just like these statues don't by themselves lead you to an understanding, but they begin to remind you of the allegory to look within and find that meaning. And I think that's, as a Quaker, how I look at religious art.
Hey, Lorcan, I can help you out. I got a few Shiva statues, and I've got you Jaya Ganesha, Jaya. Hey, if you want one, if you need a Ganesha, I got a nice Ganesha for you. I'll stop by, and
Oh,
if you need
Gormila
one,
Mahaget Tai Naistuka Frendeka. So, in my father and mother's language is thank you. I had this beautiful little ivory Ganesh somewhere, and whether it was, I think it was fake ivory, but it's just wonderful. That is just
I go
beautiful.
by, listen, I go by your place when I go out to rehearse for Barefoot in the Park coming up at the Dr. O Center in Hunter, New York. I go right by your place. I'm going to drop off a Ganesha for you. Jaya
Oh,
Ganesha, Jaya Ganesha. That's all I can say. And Om Namah Shivaya.
Dhanyavad.
Okay, so I don't want to create any problems, and thanks for the promotional ad you gave yourself, Gary. I think that was awesome. But how does your wife figure into this whole program?
Jeannie, who's sitting next to me, I'm afraid to put words in her mouth.
You
She's
can
a,
let her talk. I mean, she can enter into this.
she's going like, Jeannie has a very simple, direct way of looking at faith, and uh, she's not into philosophy. I think she's into trying to live right and do right and work hard and be the best she can be. But I, I, she and I are on, when they say opposites attract, it's the best marriages are people who are completely different in their approach to life. And I think that's what makes, I refer to Jeannie as my better three quarters, because while I'm designing the castles in the sky, Jeannie's out there figuring out how to pay the rent to, you know, to put it in that old, to paraphrase the old story. She's very practical and very good.
Well, it seems Jesus had the simplest way of living, which was love, compassion, uh, giving, and it kind of like became a little too philosophical when they decided to use it as a control entity for their own program.
In
But
in my in my studies, I'm sorry to interrupt, but my personal take on the historical Jesus, the mundane story, was that a young, most likely Druze, there's evidence he was Druze, which the idea of being Mamzer, being not mainstream, was not whether or not his parents were married, but they were not part of the original 12 tribes. And that he then falls in with John the Baptist, who we know is a historical character. There's tremendous amounts of contemporary proof that there was a John the Baptist. Um, when John the Baptist's ideal of driving out the Romans through perfection was through the mikvah, that by ritual cleansing, Judea will be delivered. And instead, he's executed. And Jesus, this young teenage uh, zealot, goes out into the world trying to find why this failed. And he meets the Samaritan woman and realizes that the core of Judaism isn't ritual cleaning, but it's feeding each other spiritually and in reality. And he says to her, "Give me to drink." And she says, "How can I do that? If I touch you or the food, it's ruined for you." And he says, "This is the water of life." Not because of his input, but because these people kept apart by their traditions. And if you look at the food analogies throughout his ministry, it's always feed each other. And the oldest of the resurrection stories, his closest friends come back from fishing after catching nothing, and a stranger feeds them. And he says, and they say, he's alive. A stranger has done what he taught. Do this in memory of me. Feed each other in memory of me. Then we have the orthodoxy, Paul coming in and saying, they didn't recognize that this was actually Jesus reborn on earth, rather than that the core of Christianity, as you say, is to feed each other spiritually and in reality. And it's why it's such a shame today that so many Christians concentrate on salvation through acceptance of his divinity rather than following the teachings of the Beatitudes. That the aspect of salvation is finding that kingdom of God of feeding each other, of being part of that whole.
What did he say to his disciples? Feed my sheep.
Feed my sheep. And just again and again and again, it's the idea of, in fact, the one of the wonderful misinterpretations when someone asks him, "What do you do when a poor person comes to your door?" and he says, "Feed them." And because of the similarity in the script in Aramaic between "feed them" and "wash his feet," it becomes "wash his feet," which is a lovely thing to do, but most likely he was saying feed the stranger.
I'm curious about how the younger generation approaches this whole sense of religion or a divine sense of being. We haven't had anybody on the podcast yet that is under 30, so I guess we'll have to do that. But it is simplicity here that really, and the Quakers do have that sense of simplicity. The fact that they sit in a room in silence, in a state of meditation, we'll say, and unless something is really important to voice, they're content with being in that state of, it's beyond silence, though.
Yeah,
it is. Yeah.
The gathered meeting, the sense that in that silence, it's an act of silence. Which leads me to my favorite Quaker joke about Arch Street in Philadelphia. And kind of as a echo of the story of the Hicksite split, is when I was a child, the big joke was Arch Street, which is an affluent meeting in Philadelphia, is so contemplative that if he sits there very still and listens very closely, you can hear the rise and fall of their stock options.
I guess that's a good place to end this podcast.
It's been a great joy.
Yes, Lorcan, thank you very much. I think you've enlightened us in both areas, and we'll have more to talk about in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I have to say this. This is my third session with Lorcan. I've had him on my radio show, Seekers and Finders, over WYOX Community Radio Catskills 91.3 FM twice, and now this podcast. And I can tell you, Lorcan is an endless fount of stories. He hasn't even, believe me, he hasn't even scratched the surface. We have to get him back on. Great stories, and they're all great stories, amazing stories.
The only source for them is, and in a very unquakerly way, I do use hair dye and beard dye. I'm just as, you get to be our age and you have stories.
I have one question, though, before we go. Who is that gentleman on the wall behind you on the right side? No, the black and white.
That's my dad, who was a Shakespearean actor. He's in Barretts of Wimpole Street with Catherine Cornell. Our family in theater begins with, you can hardly see him there, Thomas Otway in the 1620s. His brother is our direct ancestor. And we've had members in theater ever since. And then that is, on this side, is painted by John Everett Millais, is an Otway who in Ireland went to see her friend Millais, and he said, "Oh, I must paint you." She says, "No, I'm tired. I feel awful." He says, "That's exactly why I'm painting you today." It's one of my favorite of his paintings. And it's a copy, mind you, that the original is in some, the Met or some place. But so The
And the
house is
story
full of my family.
and the stories continue. Well, we'll
Yes.
definitely have to have you back for more.
Hey,
Thank you
Otway,
so much, Lorcan.
did you know I was a Shakespeare actor too? We have
Yes,
a greater connection now.
indeed. My father was in the Morris Evans G.I. Hamlet during World War II.
Hey, I was in Merry Wives of Windsor this summer. Hey,
Oh, good.
thanks for coming,
Yes.
Jaya Ganesha. I'm going to stop by with a nice Ganesha statue for you.
Oh, thank you so much. And it's been a great joy. Thank you.
The
Thank you,
joy is
Lorcan.
ours. Great joy. Thank you, Lorcan Otway. And we're just scratching the surface here, folks. Our fall lineup, we kicked it off in a big way today, but our fall lineup is just spectacular.